Okay, today is day 18. I appreciate everyone that's followed me for the last almost 3 weeks on my journey to New York and all the stuff that I've been through, getting really sick, being diagnosed with COVID, and along the way I've tried to give kind of updates. I know I said a couple days ago that I was finished, but things just keep kind of drawing me back. And so today I woke up and I had 4 text messages and another 3 or so messages online asking me about this new video that a couple of doctors made from California saying that we should reopen the country based on their data showing how many people actually had COVID. And it was an hour video, but I had nothing else to do being in quarantine. And so I watched the video, and then I started to send some replies to my friends that had asked me about it. I've become kind of the de facto expert somehow because I've been working on the front lines. And so I started to compile my answer, and then I realized that probably a larger audience needed to hear my answer. And so I decided to make another video. I can't promise I'm gonna keep making these, but at least, for today, I wanted to do the best I could to address this video. And I want to make a couple of points. One, I am decidedly not an epidemiologist. I'm not a microbiologist or virologist or immunologist or any of these things. I believe we should all listen to the experts in the country that have studied this, our entire careers. But I do understand there's a lot of people have been following, and I'd like to give my opinion to kind of my friends and family. I wouldn't think about this as a video that I want to distribute all over the world, but a conversation between friends. This is what I would say to my own family members to keep them safe. Secondly, I don't like criticizing other doctors. So if anything I say sounds like criticism, that's not my intent at all. I just want to have a science-based conversation that we can use to keep people safe. So with that being said, I want to jump into this video to set it up. These are 2 emergency room doctors from California who own urgent cares throughout Bakersfield. By the way, for what it's worth, I was born in Bakersfield, so I feel slightly tied to this. So these docs own about 7 facilities, and they called a press conference, apparently, to talk about their data and why we should change our approach. So let me just turn it over to the docs in their own words.
Couple months here at Accelerated, and really talk about what's happening in Kern County with our testing, what's happening in California with the testing, and kind of an ER physician entrepreneur perspective on what's going on, and kind of what we think the approach should be going forward. And so this has caused some severe disruption for Accelerated, and at the same time, our volumes have dropped significantly.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what he said here. And first of all, I just want to make it really clear. I don't know this physician. I have nothing against this physician. He seems like a really intelligent doc, and so does his partner, and seems really hardworking and just trying to serve the people of California. But I do want to approach this in a scientific way for my viewers. And I want to start with approaching this from the concept of bias. So I have this graphic that I'd like you to look at, and it says bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. Biases can be innate or learned. People may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief. In science and engineering, a bias is a systematic error. So I want to talk a little bit about what the biases of this physician might be. In the first couple sentences of this press conference, he talks about himself as being an entrepreneur, which kind of grabbed my attention for a physician to refer to himself as an entrepreneur so early on. And so as I listened to him, he kind of name dropped Accelerated several times, and how this crisis has had such an effect on his business. He talks about volumes being really low and it having a great impact. And so very early on, you see kind of biases emerge. Now, all of us have biases. I, for example, am incredibly biased as well. I spent the last few weeks in New York City, taking care of people who were dying on ventilators. And so certainly I'm really biased that this disease should be taken seriously. But let's go back to what he talked about. He talked about the effect it was having on his business, and his strong bias is that we should reopen, which would make sense because that's what's good for his business. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're listening to someone who's talking about science. But there's biases beyond just our own personal beliefs on what's good for us. There's actually bias in science. They're going to be biased in the data. And so I want to have the doctor here describe a little bit about his findings and how they extrapolated their data. And then I want to talk about how it might be a biased sample set.
The existence of the cases that we're learning about. So if we look at California, these numbers are from yesterday. We have 33,865 COVID cases out of a total of 280,900 total tested. That's 12% of Californians were positive for COVID. So as you guys know, the initial models were woefully inaccurate. They predicted millions of cases of death, not of prevalence or incidence, but death. That is not materializing. What is materializing in the state of California is 12% positives. Well, if we have 39.5 million people. If we just take a basic calculation and extrapolate that out, that equates to about 4.7 million cases throughout the state of California, which means this thing is widespread. That's the good news. We've seen 1,227 deaths in the state of California with a possible incidence or prevalence of 4.7 million. That means you have a 0.03 chance of dying from COVID-19 in the state of California. 0.03 chance of dying from COVID in the state of California. Does that necessitate sheltering in place? Does that necessitate shutting down medical systems? Does that necessitate people being out of work?
Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. The question is, does the state of California actually have 4.7 million people that already have COVID? And the answer is probably no, based on what we know from the disease. But more importantly, the conclusions that this doctor comes to are based on a pretty major flaw in his thinking on the data. So what he's doing is he's taking a biased sample set, a group of people that believe they have symptoms of COVID that have got tested, and then extrapolating that biased sample set to the entire population, which allows him to come up with 4.7 million people that already have it. In order to explain this a little better, what a biased sample set is, let me use the example of golf. Now, I'm biased because I love golf, and so any chance I get to talk about golf, I'm going to do it. But this is a pretty easy concept to understand. So there's about 24 million Americans that play golf today, which is about 6% of the country. So let's say I wanted to ask the question, how have you played golf in the last 12 months? And I wanted to have a sample of the United States and come up with that 6%. Well, the first thing that would be obvious is where I asked that question. So let's say I went into New York City and I walked around the streets and asked, and I asked the question, have you played golf in the last 12 months? I think what you would find is that someone in New York City asked that question would answer very differently than someone in, say, Scottsdale. This is where I live. And in Scottsdale, there's a golf course basically every couple of miles. And so if I ask that exact same question on the streets of New York or in Scottsdale, you might get very different answers. So maybe you don't completely agree with me. Maybe you think in New York, they're still likely to golf. Well, let me take my analogy a little bit further. What if I went and asked this question, have you played golf in the last 12 months? But I asked this question at a golf tournament. Now it's quite likely that every single person at that tournament has played golf because they're really into it. Well, let's say you disagree a little more. Let's say only 70% of people at that golf tournament would have played golf in the last 12 months. What if I went to the Masters, the preeminent golf tournament in the world, where just to get a ticket is $4,000 or $5,000, and I walked around and I asked people if you've played golf in the last 12 months? Now, the answer, I think we would all agree, is approaching 100%. And so just based on where I asked my questions could maybe give me 3% of people on the streets of New York City all the way up to 100% of people on the fairways at Augusta in the spring. And so I use this as an example that anytime you're using data from a biased sample set and trying to extrapolate it to the entire population, you can come up with models that are vastly off. And so these doctors talk about using all tests in California to extrapolate to all citizens of California. But the problem is most of the patients that were tested had symptoms. And so you can't take sick, symptomatic people and extrapolate that to the healthy. The doctors make a lot of kind of off-base claims in this video, but one that I wanted to draw particular attention to is the comparison of Norway and Sweden. Now, it's fairly well known that Sweden very early on took a very different approach than the rest of the world and said that they were not going to shelter in place, and they would do some minor social distancing but no major maneuvers. Norway, on the other hand, right next door with a similar population, took pretty drastic measures, probably akin to what's happened in the United States. So it really grabbed my attention what these ER docs said about Norway versus Sweden, and their numbers kind of fly in the face of science. So I want you to hear it straight from the doctor.
And then when you bring up a system of lockdown, you automatically have to compare it to a system of no lockdown, Sweden and Norway. I'm Norwegian.
Norway has lockdown.
Norway has lockdown, Sweden does not have lockdown. What happened in those two countries? Are they vastly different? Did Sweden have a massive outbreak of cases? Did Norway have nothing? Let's look at the numbers. Sweden has 15,322 cases of COVID. They did 74,600 tests, which is 21%, similar to the other countries. 21% of all those tested came out positive for COVID. What's the population of Sweden? About 10.4 million. So if we extrapolate out the data, about 2 million cases of COVID in Sweden. They did a little bit of social distancing. They would wear masks and separate. They went to schools, stores were open. They were almost about their normal daily life with a little bit of social distancing. They had how many deaths? 1,765. California's had 1,220 with isolation. No isolation, 1,765. We have more people. What I'm getting at is millions of cases, very small death. Millions of cases, very small death. This is what we're seeing everywhere. Norway, its next door neighbor. This is where I come from. These are two Scandinavian nations. We can compare them as they are similar. Let's look at the data. Norway, 7,191 cases of COVID. Total COVID tests, 145,279. So they came up with 4.9% of all COVID tests were positive in Norway. Population of Norway, 5.4 million. So if we extrapolate the data as we've been doing, which is the best we can do at this point, they have about 1.3 million cases. Now their deaths as a total number were 182, fairly small, but statistically insignificant from 1,700, you realize. Millions of cases, small amount of deaths. 1,700, 100, these are statistically insignificant. So you have a 0.003 chance of death as a citizen of Norway and a 97% recovery. Their numbers are a little bit better. Does it necessitate shutdown, loss of jobs, destruction of the oil company, furloughing doctors? That's the question I have for you. I think the answer is going to be increasingly clear as we move through this data.
Okay, so a lot to unpack here. So this doctor makes some seriously off-base claims on the data here and says that across a sample size of 20 or 30,000 tests, that there's no statistically significant difference between 1,700 and 100. And that's just not accurate. In fact, this is highly statistically significant that what happened in Norway worked out better than what happened in Sweden. So without spending too much time, I'm going to put a link below to worldometers.info where you can look at every single country in the world and how many cases there are, how many deaths there are, how many tests have been. And so it's really a good way to look at the data for yourself. So I'll put a link below. And if you dig into it, let's look at Norway first. Norway was a pretty good example of early lockdown, kind of like what has happened in the United States. We've taken a little bit longer, but I would say that Norway's approach is more similar to the United States. And what we found in Norway was with a population of around 5.3 million people, they've only had 200 deaths to date. Well, how does that compare with Sweden? Well, Sweden took the approach of really no lockdown, a little bit of social distancing, but generally speaking, they've tried the herd immunity approach. And what you see here is with only about twice as many people in Sweden, about 10.2 million, they have 11 times the death. So 2,200 deaths versus 200 deaths in Norway. And the doctor here makes the claim that that's not statistically significant, but that's just blatantly false. As a matter of fact, if you look at it on a per capita basis, Sweden had 5.5 times as many deaths. Said differently is Norway, compared to their Swedish friends, they've actually saved around 900 lives so far mathematically. And you may say 900 lives, that doesn't matter. Well, why don't we look at what effect that would have in the United States? So far, as of the time of this video, we've had 55,396 deaths in the United States. 55,396. And I like to read the full number because I think every one of those lives matters. Every one of those lives is a human that is no longer here. But what if we would have taken the Swedish approach? What if we would have just done nothing, maybe a little bit of social distancing, but we don't shut down the bars or work or anything that we've done? The mathematical model, if you compare Norway to Sweden, is we would have lost 304,000 people if we would have taken the Swedish approach. Said differently is the decisions we've made over the last 30 to 45 days have saved 250,000 Americans. And, it's not like this just happened in a bubble. We shut down the streets of New York. We shut down in Los Angeles really early. We shut down the airports. We shut down movie theaters and sporting events. We've made major decisions that have changed our economy, but have also it looks like mathematically saved about 250,000 lives over the last 30 days. And I know healthcare workers get a lot of attention for being heroes during this crisis. And I got to see on the front lines myself, people, jumping to action and saving lives. But I got to tell you, all of us are heroes for the decisions we've made over the last month. So I just have to reiterate, I'm so proud of our country right now, the healthcare workers, of all the people that have pulled together to save lives in this important time. And I think history will judge us kindly for the decisions we made to protect our most vulnerable. There was just a few other points in this really long 1-hour video that I watched that I wanted to point out for some people that had asked me about it. One is the doctors make some claims about the immune system, that staying at home and sheltering in place somehow reduces the immune system. And I just want to state really clearly, there's no data that that's true. I'm not quite sure where they get this concept, but it's not supported by science. They make multiple claims in the video that COVID is similar to the flu, and I think this is just an ongoing conversation that's occurred in our country over the last 45 days that's basically been shown not to be true. If you just look at the transmissibility of COVID, the R0 is about twice as much as the flu, meaning for every patient with COVID, they're going to infect 2 times as many people as the flu. And if you track that over 4 or 5 or 6 cycles, it doesn't mean that it's twice as many people infected, but it's a logarithmic effect. And so it ends up being 10 times as much or more. And so COVID's incredibly transmissible. It's much more lethal. I know for those that have been following my videos, it's not just a lung effect, but it attacks the blood system and the blood vessels and the heart and the kidneys and just these things we just don't see with the flu. And so there's a lot of claims in this video about it being like the flu, and I wouldn't get sucked into that line of thinking. There's a list of comorbidities given at the end of this video where they talk about the people that die have diseases like lupus and HIV, and a few other things are mentioned. And once again, that's just not supported by the data. The CDC has published some really good data. I can actually probably put a link below to this as well, talking about who's most likely to die. And it's things that are very insidious that you don't expect, like hypertension was the #1 predictor. And so I want us to be really careful not to convince ourselves that this is a disease of the marginalized or just the elderly. This is a disease that'll hit everyone. It made me incredibly sick last week, and I was very scared. I'm young and healthy, and my oxygenation was in the 80s for minutes at a time, and that's quite scary to see as an anesthesiologist. I want to give you the true list just so you guys have it. There's 6 things that are associated with high mortality from this disease. #1 is hypertension, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, lung disease, and the elderly. That's the true facts. And so I want to make sure we're aware of that. If you look at that list, these are not crazy things on the fringes. These are things that are affecting all of us. In closing, I want to say goodbye again. I'm not sure I'll do any more videos, but I wanted to make this video for some friends that had asked. I want to thank you guys for following me along on this crazy journey, for your prayers, for praying for me. It worked. I feel 95% better. My breathing is better. My oxygen saturation is better. I'm still a little tired, but I feel wonderful. And I think your prayers were a big part of that. Please continue to pray for America and New York. And I know a lot of you have been praying for my patients in New York. And I continue to pray for them. And I hope that you guys will too. God bless you guys and stay safe.